Behavioral Finance, Chapter 12. This is the application of well-known psychological behaviors, the way people behave and react to information and make decisions, and how we apply this to financial decisions. And the terminology that we're going to use is adapted from this sort of the psychology literature. So just what we're thinking about the efficient market hypothesis. Says that prices reflect information and people act rationally. So are observed behaviors consistent with these behavioral biases that we're going to talk about? Or are they consistent with efficient markets, or possibly both or neither? So we're going to categorize some behavioral biases that may lead to mispriced securities. This is not an exhaustive list. There's more stuff than we're going to talk about. We're just going to talk about a few. And we're going to talk about these in two different legs, two different areas. And the first set of behavioral biases are going to be information processing errors. These would be psychological factors that cause investors to misinterpret information or not process information correctly. This leads to incorrect expectations. And then behavioral biases, even if the investors have the correct expectations, they still make incorrect or poor decisions because of these biases. So, what if it's the case that only a couple of people are making mistakes? Well, then there are arbitrageurs who will return the prices to correctly priced equilibriums, and mispricing due to information processing or behavioral biases won't persist. So if mispricing does persist, there's got to be a lot of people making these mistakes, more than can be corrected through arbitrage activity, or maybe there are just limits to arbitrage, and we'll see that that's often the case too. So, let's start with information processing errors. And again, this is just a few. This is not a comprehensive list of all the possible information processing errors. We'll just talk about a few. So the first is a memory bias. And again, remember, these are terms that are adapted from the psychology literature. And this is when individuals place too much weight on recent events, and this can lead to forecasting errors. For example, too much weight on recent earnings growth leads to higher growth expectations. This leads to higher prices through higher PE ratios and book to market. And so the stock moves from maybe blender core to a growth stock. And then maybe it becomes overpriced, and that's what leads to a lower return. An overconfidence bias. I'm a really, really good stock picker, and you arrive at this conclusion erroneously because of a small sample of successes, or maybe success in another area. I'm really good at this. I must be really good at stock picking. Or, a stock's either going to go up or going to go down, and I buy the stock and it goes up. Oh my God, and I buy a second stock and it goes up too. Well, that's it. I'm a genius. I've figured this out. And so after a fairly small sample, you decide that you're really, really good at this. And there's a bunch of papers. Here's two of them on Canvas that are going to talk about this sort of idea of overconfidence. More trading leads to lower returns, and that men who tend to demonstrate more overconfidence than women trade more than women. The next bias in information processing, so memory overconfidence, is something called conservatism bias, in which people conserve a prior belief. In other words, they're slow to update their beliefs, usually in the context of sort of bad news. They don't want to give up some sort of favorable opinion, or if they have a long set poor opinion, they don't want to give that up in favor of a good opinion. So investors are slow to update their beliefs. They're slow to react to news that contradicts their prior expectations, and they might be unwilling to admit they made a mistake. The last one of these biases that we'll talk about is something called representativeness bias. And sometimes this is referred to as small sample bias. And you just infer too much from a small sample. This differs from memory bias. So memory bias is inferring too much from one series of data over too short a time period, where representativeness bias, or small sample bias, is inferring too much from a small sample in just a single time period. And so these are just an example of different biases that might cause you to lead to an incorrect expectation about some stock or some security. I think it's going to go up, and I'm not really sure, what the basis of these things are, but it just could be overconfident, or that I'm using some sort of small recent sample, or I've just always thought that. But for whatever reason, I have an incorrect expectation. And so these are our information processing error biases.